The sun was setting over downtown Atlanta, casting long shadows across the bustling streets. In a modest courtroom, filled with the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the rustling of papers, Maya Thompson stood quietly, her hands clasped in front of her. She was an unassuming figure, dressed in a simple blouse and slacks, but there was something about her presence that commanded attention. Her calm demeanor masked the storm brewing inside her. Just hours earlier, she had been driving home from work when blue lights flashed behind her. A broken taillight, the officer said. Annoying, yes, but nothing to ruin her day. But things took a turn when the officer asked for her license and registration. His tone shifted, becoming unnecessarily sharp. He claimed she hadn't complied quickly enough, though Mia knew she'd followed every instruction. Then came accusations that she resisted when he tried to handcuff her, a claim so absurd it left her stunned. Before she could fully process what was happening, she found herself sitting in the back of a police car, her mind racing with disbelief. How did a minor traffic stop spiral into an arrest? Now, standing before Judge Richard Hargrove, Mia felt like she was living someone else's nightmare. The courtroom smelled of old wood and stale air, a place where justice was supposed to be served, but often felt more like a game of chance. Judge Hargrove adjusted his glasses, peering down at Mia with an expression that bordered on disdain. His reputation preceded him. He was known for being tough, almost to the point of cruelty, especially toward defendants who didn't fit his idea of respectable. And Mia, a black woman dressed plainly, seemed to check all the wrong boxes. Miss Thompson, the judge began, his voice dripping with impatience, you understand why you're here today. Without waiting for her response, he launched into a lecture about obeying laws and showing respect to law enforcement. Mia nodded politely, choosing her words carefully. Your Honor, I believe there's been a misunderstanding, she said, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. I cooperated fully during the stop, and I'm confident we can resolve this without escalating matters. Judge Hargrove raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. Cooperated. Officer Jenkins has a very different account of what happened. He glanced at the prosecutor, who shuffled through documents without meeting Maya's gaze. It was as if they'd already decided her fate, reducing her side of the story to mere formalities. The weight of the moment pressed down on Mia, but she refused to let it break her. She straightened her posture, reminding herself of who she was. A professional, a fighter, someone who understood the intricacies of the law better than most people in the room. Yet, no matter how much knowledge or poise she carried, she couldn't escape the sinking feeling that this wasn't just about a broken taillight anymore. As the proceedings dragged on, Mia noticed subtle cues, the way the judge dismissed her attempts to speak, the way the court clerk avoided eye contact, the way even the bailiff seemed uneasy. It wasn't hard to see that this case wasn't being judged fairly. Still, Mia held on to hope. She reminded herself that truth had a way of surfacing, even in the murkiest waters. Little did anyone know, including Judge Hargrove, that this seemingly ordinary courtroom drama was about to take a dramatic turn, one that would leave everyone rethinking their assumptions. The courtroom incident didn't just change Mia's life. It ignited a fire within her that burned brighter with each passing day. Instead of allowing the ordeal to harden her or make her cynical, Mia channeled her frustration into action. She knew that while exposing Judge Hargrove's bias was important, it wasn't enough. Real change required more than calling out individual wrongdoing. It demanded systemic transformation. And so, Mia dedicated herself to becoming a voice for those who had been silenced by prejudice. Her first step was turning her personal experience into a rallying cry. At community forums and legal conferences, Mia began sharing her story, not as a tale of victimhood, but as a testament to resilience and the urgent need for reform. What happened to me isn't unique, she often said, her voice steady yet impassioned. It happens every single day to people who don't have the privilege of walking away from a courtroom unscathed. My job now is to ensure their voices are heard. Mia's advocacy quickly gained momentum. Using her position as chief legal advisor, she spearheaded a statewide initiative called Justice Without Bias. The program focused on three key areas: education, accountability, and transparency. For education, she worked with experts to design mandatory training sessions for judges, lawyers, and law enforcement officers on recognizing and addressing implicit bias. These workshops weren't about assigning blame. They were about fostering awareness and empathy. Participants left with practical tools to challenge their own assumptions and create fairer interactions in the courtroom. Accountability came next. Recognizing that unchecked power often led to abuse, Mia pushed for the creation of an independent oversight board tasked with investigating complaints against judicial officials. This board would include representatives from diverse backgrounds, community leaders, legal professionals, and even former defendants, to ensure multiple perspectives were considered. It was a bold move, met with resistance from some corners of the judiciary. But Maya stood firm. If we want trust in the system, we have to prove we're willing to hold ourselves accountable, she argued during a heated legislative hearing. Transparency became the cornerstone of Mia's efforts. She advocated for recording all courtroom proceedings, making them accessible to the public unless sensitive matters required confidentiality. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, she liked to say, quoting a famous adage. By opening the doors of justice to scrutiny, she hoped to eliminate the secrecy that allowed bias to thrive. But perhaps Mia's most impactful contribution was amplifying the voices of those directly affected by systemic injustice. She organized town halls where ordinary citizens could share their experiences with the legal system. Some spoke of being profiled by police, others of facing harsh sentences for minor offenses, and still others of feeling invisible in courtrooms dominated by people who didn't look like them or understand their struggles. Each story added depth to Mia's mission, grounding her work in the lived realities of the people she sought to help. As word of her efforts spread, Mia became a symbol of hope for many. Protesters marching against racial injustice carried signs bearing her name alongside slogans like "Fair Courts for All." Students studying law wrote essays about her courage and determination. Even critics who initially dismissed her as an opportunist began to acknowledge the sincerity behind her actions. Her story proved that adversity could be transformed into advocacy, that one person's stand against injustice could spark a movement. Yet, despite the accolades and progress, Maya remained humble. She knew the fight was far from over. Every victory felt bittersweet because it reminded her of how much work still lay ahead. But she also knew that change was possible, one step, one policy, one conversation at a time. As she looked out at the growing coalition of supporters joining her cause, Maya felt a quiet sense of pride. She hadn't set out to become a leader, but sometimes leadership finds you when you least expect it. And Mia was ready to lead, not for herself, but for everyone counting on her to keep pushing forward. The courtroom felt smaller with each passing minute, the air thick with tension. Judge Hargrove leaned back in his chair, his expression a mix of boredom and irritation. He glanced at Mia as if she were an inconvenience he couldn't wait to dismiss. "Miss Thompson," he said, his tone sharp and condescending, "you seem to think this is some kind of misunderstanding. But let's be clear. Officer Jenkins has provided a detailed account of your behavior." His voice carried a note of finality, as though her side of the story was irrelevant. Mia took a deep breath, keeping her composure intact. She had faced difficult situations before, but something about this moment felt different. The judge wasn't just ignoring her words. He seemed determined not to see her at all. "Your Honor," she began again, her voice calm but firm, "I understand the seriousness of the charges, but I'd like to clarify my perspective. I cooperated fully during the stop, and I believe there's been a miscommunication." Before she could continue, Judge Hargrove cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Miscommunication. Officer Jenkins stated under oath that you were uncooperative and argumentative. Are you calling him a liar?" The question hung in the air, heavy and loaded. It was a tactic Maya recognized all too well. an attempt to paint her as disrespectful or combative. But she didn't take the bait. Instead, she replied evenly, "No, Your Honor. I'm simply asking for the opportunity to explain what happened from my point of view." The judge sighed dramatically, rolling his eyes as if her request was unreasonable. "Fine, Ms. Thompson. Go ahead. But make it quick." His impatience was palpable, and the few people in the gallery exchanged uneasy glances. Even the court clerk seemed uncomfortable, typing slowly as if trying to avoid drawing attention to herself. As Mia spoke, laying out the events of the traffic stop step by step, Judge Hargrove barely listened. He shuffled through papers, occasionally glancing at his watch. When she mentioned her background in law, hoping to establish credibility, he smirked. "Oh, so you're a lawyer now?" he asked sarcastically. "What kind of law do you practice?" "Traffic violations." The comment drew a few stifled chuckles from the prosecutor's table, but Mia didn't flinch. She smiled faintly, choosing to rise above the insult. "Actually, Your Honor, I work in legal advisory roles. My focus is on policy reform and ensuring fairness within the justice system." Her words were measured, designed to convey professionalism without sounding defensive. But Judge Hargrove clearly wasn't interested in hearing about her credentials, or anything else she had to say. Throughout the exchange, subtle signs of bias became harder to ignore. The judge interrupted her repeatedly, talked over her explanations, and dismissed her points with little regard for their merit. At one point, he even remarked, "People like you need to learn how to follow rules instead of making excuses." The phrase "people like you" lingered uncomfortably in the room, vague yet unmistakably pointed. It wasn't the first time Mia had encountered such language, but hearing it in a courtroom, a place meant to uphold justice, felt particularly jarring. Despite the judge's dismissive attitude, Mia remained composed. She knew losing her temper would only play into his narrative. Instead, she focused on planting seeds of doubt, gently challenging his assumptions while maintaining respect for the process. Still, it was impossible not to notice how the dynamics in the room shifted against her. Every word she spoke seemed to fall on deaf ears, while the prosecution's arguments, no matter how weak, were met with nods of approval. As the hearing dragged on, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about a broken taillight anymore. This was about power, perception, and prejudice, all wrapped up in a judicial system that often failed those it claimed to protect. Yet even in the face of blatant unfairness, Maya refused to give up. She reminded herself that sometimes the truth doesn't reveal itself immediately. Sometimes it waits for the right moment to shine. And when it does, it can change everything. The moment Mia revealed her identity as the governor's chief legal advisor, the courtroom seemed to shrink under the weight of shock and disbelief. Whispers rippled through the gallery, growing louder with each passing second. Reporters who had been idly typing notes suddenly snapped to attention, their fingers flying across keyboards. Phones buzzed incessantly as news of the revelation spread beyond the courthouse walls. What had started as a routine hearing was rapidly spiraling into a story that would dominate headlines for days. Outside the courtroom, journalists stationed in the hallway quickly pieced together what had happened inside. Social media lit up almost instantly, with clips of Mia's calm yet powerful declaration going viral. "Did you hear? That woman Judge Hargrove tried to throw in jail is the governor's top legal advisor," one reporter exclaimed to another. Within minutes, hashtags like #JusticeForMia and #BiasExposed began trending statewide, drawing reactions from ordinary citizens, activists, and even politicians. The public outrage was immediate and overwhelming. Governor Evelyn Hayes didn't wait long to respond. Known for her no-nonsense approach to leadership, she issued a scathing statement condemning Judge Hargrove's behavior. "What occurred today is unacceptable," the governor declared, her words sharp but measured. "No individual should face discrimination or unfair treatment based on prejudice, especially not in a courtroom where justice is supposed to be blind. We will investigate this matter thoroughly and ensure accountability." Her message was clear. This wasn't just about Mia. It was about protecting the integrity of the entire justice system. As protests erupted outside courthouses across the state, supporters carried signs bearing slogans like "Fair Courts for All" and "End Judicial Bias." Many held portraits of Mia, turning her into an accidental symbol of resistance against systemic inequality. For some, her story resonated deeply because it mirrored their own struggles, being dismissed, underestimated, or mistreated simply because of who they were. Protesters chanted her name alongside calls for reform, transforming a personal injustice into a rallying cry for broader change. Inside the legal community, reactions were mixed. Some judges and attorneys privately expressed relief that the issue of bias was finally being addressed, while others bristled at the scrutiny, arguing that singling out one case risked undermining respect for the judiciary as a whole. But the tide of public opinion was undeniable. Editorials poured in from newspapers nationwide, dissecting Judge Hargrove's actions and questioning whether similar biases lurked unchecked in other courtrooms. Legal experts debated the need for reforms, with many pointing to Mia's experience as evidence that transparency and accountability were long overdue. Meanwhile, Mia herself became the center of a media storm. Requests for interviews flooded her office, and camera crews camped outside her home, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. At first, she felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention. This wasn't the life she had chosen. It was thrust upon her. But as messages of support poured in from strangers sharing their own stories of injustice, Mia realized the magnitude of what had happened. Her voice had struck a chord, awakening a collective demand for fairness that couldn't be ignored. One email stood out among the hundreds she received. It was from a young law student named Jasmine, who wrote, "Thank you for showing me that standing up for yourself isn't just possible, it's necessary. Because of you, I believe I can make a difference too." Reading those words, Mia felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about exposing one judge's misconduct. It was about inspiring others to challenge the status quo and fight for a better future. By the end of the day, it was clear that Mia's revelation had sparked something much larger than anyone could have anticipated. What began as a single act of defiance in a small Atlanta courtroom had ignited a statewide, and soon national, conversation about bias, accountability, and the urgent need for reform. And though the road ahead promised challenges, Mia knew she wasn't alone. Thousands of voices had joined hers, united in the pursuit of justice. The fallout from the courtroom incident was swift and far-reaching, sending shockwaves through Atlanta's legal community and beyond. Within hours of Mia's revelation, news outlets picked up the story, amplifying her confrontation with Judge Hargrove into a national conversation about bias in the justice system. Social media buzzed with outrage as clips of the hearing circulated widely, showing Judge Hargrove's dismissive tone and his stammering reaction when confronted with Mia's true identity. The hashtag #BiasInCourt trended for days, accompanied by calls for accountability and reform. Under mounting public pressure, the Judicial Conduct Commission launched an investigation into Judge Hargrove's conduct. What started as a review of his handling of Mia's case quickly expanded to include past rulings where defendants had alleged unfair treatment. Dozens of individuals came forward with stories eerily similar to Mia's, accounts of being talked over, belittled, or harshly sentenced because they didn't fit the judge's narrow definition of respectable. One woman recounted how he had mocked her for wearing casual clothes during a custody hearing. Another man described being labeled a troublemaker simply for questioning the evidence against him. Each testimony added fuel to the growing fire surrounding Judge Hargrove's reputation. For Mia, the spotlight was both empowering and exhausting. Reporters camped outside her office, eager for statements, while emails and messages poured in from supporters across the country. Some praised her composure under pressure, calling her a hero for standing up to systemic injustice. Others shared their own experiences of discrimination within the legal system, thanking her for shining a light on issues that had long been ignored. Though grateful for the support, Mia knew the real work lay ahead. This wasn't just about one judge. It was about dismantling the biases embedded in the very fabric of the judiciary. Governor Evelyn Hayes wasted no time addressing the controversy. In a televised press conference, she condemned Judge Hargrove's actions and announced a statewide initiative to combat bias in the courts. Standing alongside Mia, Governor Hayes emphasized the importance of fairness and transparency in the justice system. "What happened here is unacceptable," the governor declared, her voice firm but compassionate. "No one should face prejudice because of who they are or what they look like. We must do better, and we will." Mia seized the opportunity to push for meaningful change. Drawing on her expertise as chief legal advisor, she spearheaded a series of reforms aimed at holding judges accountable for biased behavior. Among the proposals were mandatory training programs on implicit bias, increased oversight of courtroom proceedings, and the creation of an independent body to investigate complaints against judicial officials. She also advocated for greater diversity among judges, arguing that representation mattered not only for fairness, but for rebuilding public trust in the system. Not everyone welcomed these efforts with open arms. Some judges pushed back, claiming the reforms infringed on their autonomy. Critics argued that singling out individual cases risked undermining the credibility of the entire judiciary. But Maya remained undeterred. At town hall meetings and panel discussions, she listened to concerns while firmly defending the need for accountability. "This isn't about punishing anyone," she explained. "It's about ensuring that every person who walks into a courtroom feels seen, heard, and treated fairly. That's what justice means." As weeks turned into months, the impact of Mia's advocacy became undeniable. Judge Hargrove faced disciplinary hearings that ultimately led to his suspension and eventual removal from the bench, a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked bias. Meanwhile, the initiatives Mia championed gained traction, earning praise from civil rights organizations and lawmakers alike. Her courage had sparked a movement, inspiring others to speak out against injustice and demand a fairer system. Through it all, Maya stayed grounded, reminding herself why she had chosen this path in the first place. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about creating a world where no one had to endure what she had faced in that courtroom. And though the road ahead would be long and challenging, she took solace in knowing that every step brought them closer to true justice. Months after the courtroom incident that had thrust her into the national spotlight, Mia Thompson found herself reflecting on how much had changed, not just in her life, but in the world around her. Judge Hargrove's career was effectively over, his removal from the bench serving as a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked bias. For many, his downfall symbolized accountability, proof that no one was above scrutiny, not even those tasked with upholding justice. But for Mia, it wasn't about punishment, it was about progress. The real victory lay in the ripple effects of that single moment. The initiatives Mia championed began to take root, transforming systems and mindsets across the state. Mandatory bias training programs became standard practice in courthouses, with judges and attorneys engaging in candid discussions about privilege, prejudice, and fairness. At first, some participants resisted, dismissing the workshops as unnecessary or overly critical. But over time, attitudes shifted. One veteran judge admitted during a session, "I never realized how my words could affect someone until I heard stories like Ms. Thompson's." It was a small admission, but it represented a monumental step toward understanding. The independent oversight board Mia fought so hard to establish also proved its worth. Within its first year, the board reviewed dozens of cases involving allegations of judicial misconduct, leading to disciplinary actions against several officials. More importantly, it gave ordinary citizens a platform to voice their concerns without fear of retaliation. People who once felt powerless now had a mechanism to hold the system accountable, and they weren't afraid to use it. Transparency measures further reshaped the legal landscape. Courtroom recordings, once controversial, became a routine part of proceedings. Media outlets and watchdog organizations analyzed these records, shedding light on patterns of behavior that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Judges, aware they were being observed, became more mindful of their conduct. While some grumbled about the added pressure, most acknowledged that transparency ultimately strengthened public trust in the judiciary. Beyond policy changes, Mia's impact extended to the cultural fabric of society. Her story inspired countless individuals to speak out against injustice, whether in courtrooms, workplaces, or communities. Activists cited her courage as a blueprint for challenging systemic inequities, while young lawyers looked to her as a role model for using their skills to drive meaningful change. Schools introduced curricula based on her advocacy, teaching students the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it feels daunting. For Mia personally, the journey came with both rewards and sacrifices. She received awards and recognition, including an honorary doctorate from her alma mater, but she remained grounded, deflecting praise onto the broader movement she represented. Still, the weight of constant visibility sometimes wore on her. Late nights spent drafting policies and attending meetings left little room for rest, and there were moments when self-doubt crept in. Yet every time she considered stepping back, she thought of the people counting on her, the mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters who deserved a fair shot at justice. That kept her going. As years passed, Mia's legacy solidified. Textbooks began mentioning her alongside civil rights icons, highlighting her role in modernizing the justice system. Statues and plaques honoring her contributions appeared in public spaces, though Mia herself preferred quieter tributes. A handwritten letter from a grateful defendant, a hug from a stranger who said she'd given them hope. These moments reminded her why she had started this fight in the first place. Not for fame, but for fairness. Looking back, Mia knew the battle wasn't fully won. Bias still lingered in corners of the system, stubborn and insidious. But she also knew something else. Change was possible. Every reform, every conversation, every act of courage brought them closer to a world where justice truly belonged to everyone. And as long as there were people willing to stand up and demand better, that world would inch nearer each day. Mia smiled softly as she walked through the bustling streets of Atlanta, now lined with murals celebrating resilience and equality. Somewhere deep inside, she allowed herself a quiet moment of pride, not for what she had achieved alone, but for the collective effort that had turned one woman's defiance into a catalyst for lasting change. The courtroom was eerily quiet as Judge Hargrove prepared to deliver his verdict. The tension in the air was palpable, pressing down on everyone present. Mia stood tall, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression calm but resolute. She had done everything she could to explain her side of the story, to appeal to reason and fairness, but it felt like speaking into a void. Now, all she could do was wait. Judge Hargrove cleared his throat, shuffling through papers as if searching for justification he hadn't already decided upon long ago. "Miss Thompson," he began, his voice stern and final, "after reviewing the facts of this case, and considering your behavior during the traffic stop, I find you guilty of resisting arrest and failure to comply with law enforcement." He paused briefly, letting the weight of his words sink in before continuing. "For these offenses, I sentence you to 6 months in county jail and impose a fine of $5,000. The room seemed to freeze. 6 months. For a broken taillight and an alleged misunderstanding. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Even the bailiff looked surprised, glancing at the judge with raised eyebrows. A murmur rippled through the small crowd gathered in the gallery, though it quickly faded under the oppressive silence that followed. Mia's heart sank, but she refused to let despair take hold. Instead, she straightened her posture, her mind racing. This couldn't be happening. Not like this. Not without someone stepping back to see the bigger picture. As the clerk began reading out the details of her sentence, Mia took a deep breath. She knew what she had to do. "Your Honor," she said firmly, cutting through the monotony of the clerk's voice. Her tone was polite but unwavering, demanding attention without raising her voice. All eyes turned to her, including Judge Hargrove's, who looked annoyed at the interruption. Before we proceed further, there's something important I need to disclose. The judge sighed heavily, leaning back in his chair. What is it now, Ms. Thompson? He asked, exasperated. If you're planning to argue the sentence, I assure you. It's not about the sentence, Mia interrupted gently but decisively. She stepped forward slightly, her presence commanding despite her petite frame. I wanted to clarify my identity because it seems there may have been some misunderstandings here today. She paused for effect, letting her words hang in the air. Every person in the room leaned forward slightly, curiosity sparking in their expressions. I am not just any defendant standing before you, she continued, her voice steady and clear. I serve as the chief legal advisor to Governor Evelyn Hayes. The name landed like a thunderclap. Governor Hayes was one of the most influential figures in the state, known for championing reforms in criminal justice and tackling systemic issues head-on. The mention of her title alone carried significant weight. For a moment, no one moved. Judge Hargrove blinked rapidly, his face draining of color as the implications set in. The prosecutor nearly dropped his pen, while the court clerk stopped typing mid-sentence. Even the bailiff shifted awkwardly, unsure how to react. It was as if the entire room had collectively gasped, but swallowed the sound instead. Mia didn't wait for them to recover. In my role, I oversee initiatives aimed at addressing bias within our judicial system, she added, driving her point home. Which makes today's proceedings particularly concerning, not just for me, but for the integrity of the system itself. Judge Hargrove stammered, clearly flustered. Well, Miss Thompson, I wasn't aware of your position, he said, his earlier confidence crumbling. Had I known, you might have approached this case differently. Mia finished for him, her tone neutral but pointed. She didn't need to say more. The unspoken accusation hung heavy between them. The judge fumbled with his gavel, looking anywhere but at her, while the prosecutor hastily scribbled notes, likely preparing for damage control. As the reality of the situation settled over the courtroom, Maya felt a flicker of vindication, but also sadness. Justice shouldn't depend on titles or connections. It should stand on its own, blind and impartial. Yet here they were, proving once again how fragile and flawed the system truly was. Still, Mia knew this moment wasn't just about her. It was about exposing the cracks so they could finally be repaired. The courtroom, once heavy with tension, now buzzed with an electric energy as Mia's revelation sank in. Judge Hargrove sat frozen behind the bench, his face pale and his hands gripping the edge of the desk as if to steady himself. For a man who had spent decades ruling over cases with an air of authority, he suddenly looked small, like a chess player who had just realized he'd made a catastrophic move. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint rustle of papers and the occasional cough from the gallery. Mia stood calmly, her posture unwavering. She didn't gloat or raise her voice. Instead, she let the weight of her words settle naturally. Your Honor, she continued, her tone measured but firm, my position isn't meant to excuse anything I've done today, or haven't done. But it does highlight a troubling pattern. If someone like me, a professional, a public servant, can be treated this way in your courtroom, what hope do others have? Those without titles or connections. Her question hung in the air, sharp and unanswerable. Judge Hargrove opened his mouth to respond but found no immediate defense. Instead, he cleared his throat awkwardly, attempting to regain control of the situation. Miss Thompson, he began, his voice wavering slightly, I assure you that my decisions are always based on the facts of the case, not external factors. External factors, Maya repeated softly, raising an eyebrow. Her calm demeanor carried more power than any outburst could have. Is my identity an external factor, Your Honor? Or is it simply another lens through which bias operates? She paused, letting the implication sink in. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while the court clerk stared at her keyboard, unsure whether to resume typing. Realizing he had painted himself into a corner, Judge Hargrove tried to backtrack. Of course, Miss Thompson, given your role, we must ensure that all proceedings are handled with the utmost fairness. He glanced around the room, perhaps hoping for support from the other officials, but their expressions remained unreadable. Perhaps we should revisit the sentencing. No need, Your Honor, Mia interrupted smoothly, cutting him off before he could spin the narrative further. What's been said here today speaks for itself, and frankly, revisiting the sentence wouldn't change the underlying issue: the lack of impartiality in how this case was handled from the start. Her words struck a nerve, not just with Judge Hargrove, but with everyone present. Even those who hadn't initially paid much attention were now fully engaged, leaning forward in their seats as if witnessing history unfold. A few murmurs broke out in the gallery, whispers of disbelief and admiration mingling together. One woman muttered under her breath, "Good for her," loud enough for those nearby to hear. Judge Hargrove, visibly rattled, attempted one last effort to salvage his dignity. "Very well, Ms. Thompson. Let the record show that the charges against you are hereby dismissed, in light of new information." He banged his gavel with unnecessary force, as though trying to assert dominance over a moment that had already slipped beyond his control. But the damage was done, and everyone knew it. As Mia gathered her belongings and turned to leave, she felt a mix of emotions swirling inside her. Relief, yes, but also frustration. This wasn't about personal vindication. It was about exposing a system riddled with flaws. She had walked into the courtroom as an ordinary citizen facing injustice, and now she was leaving as a symbol of resistance against systemic bias. Outside the courtroom, reporters who had been waiting for updates quickly picked up on the dramatic turn of events. Word spread like wildfire, fueled by snippets of Mia's powerful statements and Judge Hargrove's flustered response. Social media lit up within minutes, with hashtags like #JusticeForMia trending statewide. People shared videos of the hearing, dissecting every word and gesture, while activists seized the moment to highlight broader issues of inequality in the justice system. For Mia, the reactions were both heartening and overwhelming. As she stepped into the hallway, blinking under the fluorescent lights, she reminded herself why she had spoken up. It wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever felt dismissed, underestimated, or mistreated because of their race, gender, or background. Today's victory was bittersweet, but it was also a reminder that even in the darkest moments, courage could spark change. And so, as the world began to take notice of what had happened in that small Atlanta courtroom, Maya resolved to use this moment not as an endpoint, but as a beginning, a catalyst for the work she knew still needed to be done.